Hello, everybody. Welcome to Readercon. My name is Henry Lien. I am an author originally from Taiwan, now living in Hollywood, California, on the ancestral lands of the Tongva and Chumash peoples. And I'm here to talk to you today about the Rad East Asian four-act structure. Now, there are some assumptions that we as readers and writers here in the West have probably obtained by osmosis from our decades of reading stories produced in the West for Westerners. And there are some assumptions, such as the idea that the hero's journey is some sort of natural and ingrained and necessary structure that we are wired on a species level to require for a satisfying story. And same thing for three-act structure. Similar arguments for stories that are based on a rising self-esteem arc and characters finding their power. These are all candidates for how to create a satisfying story, but I think that they are also particularly Western obsessions. And I'm here to talk a little bit about some alternatives drawing from East Asian culture. Now, a couple of caveats. First of all, I am not here as an ethnologist. I'm not here as a sociologist. I'm not here as a scholar or an academic. I am not here as an authority in any of those ways. I'm just here as one artist trying to make sense of things that he has observed. So these are my personal impressions. I am not here to speak for all of East Asian culture. I'm just here to share my own observations. Another caveat is I'm going to be throwing around terms like the West and Western. And obviously the West is not a monolith. The West is composed of many different nations and cultures and identities. And also geographically, the West might seem to refer to a particular place, but there are traditions and cultures within that geographic area that don't constitute the West. For example, there are many indigenous cultures that are located in what we call the West that is not included in my definition of Western culture. What I'm talking about when I say the West and Western culture, I'm talking about the canonical classical culture that is derived from European culture. That is what I'm talking about when I say the West. I think that's the end of the caveats. So before I can talk to you about the Rad East Asian four-act structure, I think I need to orient us in counterpoint by talking about the assumptions about what structure looks like in Western storytelling. So most of you probably have heard of the three-act structure, and many of you have probably heard of the five-act variant called the Freytag pyramid. And I want to point, I'm not going to go over those in detail, but I want to point out some specific features of those structures that are probably assumed by many people in the West to be inherent to any satisfying story, but I think are actually specific to these structures. So one of the features is that these are structures that are driven by conflict, tension, and resolution. We expect the protagonist, usually an antagonist, but even if there's not a physical antagonist of any sort, conflict does drive these stories. So it can be inner conflict, but some sort of conflict must drive the story. An issue must be resolved. The character must change and grow in response to the attempt to resolve the issue, whether that conflict is with an external foe or with something in the character's own heart. That changing and growing in response to this conflict, this tension between forces, whether they are one character versus another character or forces within a character's own heart, that is what drives these Western storytelling act structures. So conflict, tension, and the resolution thereof are very important to Western storytelling. And the other thing is symmetry. And when I say symmetry, I don't mean that the various acts composing the story have to be of uniform length. What I mean by symmetry is that the Western act structures require that the same elements be at the beginning of the story as at the end of the story. So if you don't set something up properly so that you have it by the end of the story but not at the beginning of the story, people will say, well, that came out of nowhere. I mean, people don't want Star Wars to have Darth Vader show up in the last act, or the Death Star show up in the last act. They'll say, that came out of nowhere. You didn't set that up properly. That's what I mean by symmetry. On the flip side, you don't want to pose a major element in the beginning and then not return to it at the end, because Western readers will say, well, but you didn't finish the story. You didn't say what happened to Darth Vader, what happened to the Death Star. You don't want the Death Star and Darth Vader set up at the beginning and then just have them disappear from the story. So that's what I mean by symmetry. The elements at the beginning of the story should be the same elements at the end of the story, and whatever central question you pose as a central problem, the central issue, the central conflict in the story is expected to be resolved at least to some extent by the end of the story. Now, note that when I am saying West and Western, there is a time cap on some of these elements, because if we go back to Greek drama, the idea of symmetry does not carry through in the same way. The Greeks loved it when you had a story painted into a corner, and then one of the gods would swoop down and resolve the story from the corner it was painted into. And it was called Deus Ex Machina. That means God from a machine. And that's because the deity would appear on stage in some sort of contraptions, such as pulleys or levers, some sort of mechanical contraption. So that's why that plot device became called Deus Ex Machina. And that was seen as being completely fine to the ancient Greeks, that the gods would let their mortals play around until they couldn't resolve it, and then the gods swoop in to solve it to kind of reassert their dominance over the mortals, and reassert their relevance to the lives of the mortals. So that was seen, that asymmetry where something, the resolution of the story came out of nowhere at the end. That was not seen as a flaw in the story. So that's also an illustration of how traditions change. And even though Greek culture is the foundation for so much of Western culture, here is a feature in the storytelling aesthetics of one of the foundations of Western culture that was very different from what we have now. So cultures do change, and cultures are not monoliths. But the assumptions that we have now about what constitute a satisfying story are very much based on these values that I've just laid out. The idea the stories are based on conflict, tension, and resolution, and that they have to be symmetrical. That is the foundation of 99% of the books created today, especially in genre work. And I'd like you now to meet the East Asian 4-act structure. The East Asian 4-act structure is a structure with a long history in cultures including China, Taiwan, Japan, and Korea, and it's most known in the West by its Japanese name, Kisho Tenketsu. That's Ki, K-I, Ten, T-E-N, Kisho, S-H-O, Sho, S-H-O, Ten, T-E-N, Ketsu, K-E-T-S-O, K-I, S-H-O-T-E-N-K-E-T-S-U, Kisho Tenketsu. And Kisho Tenketsu is, let me lay out the acts for you, because it's kind of counterintuitive for Westerners. The first act is the introduction of the main elements, such as the main characters and where the setting might be, what genre of story this is going to be. Those are some of the main elements possible. So the first act is introducing the main elements. Okay, nothing surprising there. Second act is just development of those same elements, which is on a very, very slight incline, but a pretty flat incline here. There's no throwing in of elements to raise the stakes or heighten the tension. No, it's a super gentle incline. That's Act 2, the development of the same elements that we introduced in Act 1. Act 3, though, is almost always a twist, which is often in the form of an entirely new main element. So we are violating one of the laws here of Western storytelling, which says that you have to introduce the main elements in the first act. Here, we are holding back one of the main elements until the third act, until after the halfway point in the story. So it's like Darth Vader shows up after the halfway point in Star Wars. And what happens with the ramp is that first act and the second act, it's a very, very gentle incline. And then you hit that third act and it spikes up with that new element. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that new element does as well. And then the fourth act is the downward incline. It's the conclusion, but it's a different conclusion from what you might expect from a Western story. I call it the harmonizing of all the elements. And by harmonizing, I don't mean a peaceful resolution necessarily of any conflict that might be there, or some sort of unity among the elements that came before. What I mean is drawing out the perhaps invisible relationships among the elements that came before, including that surprise third act element that seems like it has nothing to do with anything. That fourth act is showing you they all do have a relationship with each other. And then it often ends quite abruptly. So let me point out some features of this. The most startling feature is, of course, that third act, which brings in the new element. And what that does is it creates more of a sense of surprise when you have not seeded in all of the elements, when you have not foreshadowed even all the elements, when you hold back one of the main features of the story until the second half, it lands in the story like an asteroid, and it creates greater disruption and greater shock and greater surprise. It's more effective as a plot twist because it has not been greatly foreshadowed, and it has not been seeded in, and it has not played a significant part of the story. Another feature of that third act new element is that it often changes the very genre of the story, so that we might be starting off with some rom-com that suddenly becomes a gritty war drama. It actually changes the genre of the story in many cases. And the final effect that I would like to point out is that this is a significantly harder structure to pull off because you are holding back one of the main features of your story until the second half of the story, which raises the bar on your storytelling for the first half. You've got to keep people as entertained as you would otherwise, even though you're holding back one of the main elements. That raises the bar on what is remaining in those first two acts. And then the fourth act also, I would like to point out, is different from, is significantly different from the final act of the Western structures, because once again, it is showing you the invisible relationships among the elements that came before, including that surprise new element in the third act, but it's also often quite abrupt. And it leaves on a note of ambiguity and leaves you participating in wondering how the story actually ended. And as you can also see, there is no symmetry in this structure. The elements at the beginning are not the elements at the end, and that's considered a feature, not a bug, of the storytelling structure. So it is fundamentally different from Western storytelling structures in this aspect. It can be based on conflict, tension, and resolution, but it doesn't have to be. It can be the characters trying to absorb new information, this new element that came into their world in that third act. And that third act doesn't necessarily have to, that third act element doesn't necessarily have to be in conflict with anything. It can just be, an adjustment that the characters have to make. Now, of course, there are, Eastern culture is not a monolith either. There are many stories told in Kisho Tenketsu that are about conflict, but that is not the fundamental driver of the structure. The driver of the structure is, how do we absorb something new? I mean, maybe it could even be good news. What if you discovered halfway through your story that your character has wings? Well, that could be a very welcome thing, but it's going to take some adjustment for them to incorporate that into their world. That's what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily driven by conflict, tension, and resolution. It's all about how you gracefully absorb or disgracefully absorb that third element into your existing world. Okay, this is all very abstract. I'm sure I'm losing a lot of you now. People have probably tuned out. Let me give you an example to anchor this. This example is a poem, a four-line poem by the Edo period poet Sanyo Rai, and it's called The Daughters of Itoya. And the poem goes like this. First line. The daughters of Itoya live in Osaka. One daughter is 16 and the other is 14. In Japanese history, warriors killed the enemy with bows and arrows. However, the daughters of Itoya kill with their eyes. Okay, so that's a weird story, right? But let's savor what it's doing. Let's break this down. So that first act, the daughters of Itoya live in Osaka. Okay, so we introduced the main elements, the two daughters and the setting. And Act 2 is just developing the same elements. One daughter is 16, the other is 14. So we get a sense of their age relationship. They're far apart enough in age so that there is an older and younger sibling dynamic, but they're close enough that they probably played together when they are young. So we're getting more development of those very same elements about this story taking place in Osaka, historical story that seems like a very quiet domestic story about sibling relationships. And then that third act hits us. In Japanese history, warriors killed the enemy with bows and arrows. I was like, where did that come from? Suddenly we've got warriors, we've got killing, we've got enemies, we've got bows and arrows. Okay, so that's invading the story. It seems like a completely different story now. That has nothing to do with the quiet domestic story about two daughters in Osaka that came before. But the fourth act shows you the relationship. However, the daughters of Itoya kill with their eyes. So it's showing that the elements in the first two acts, these two daughters, one of whom is 16 and one of whom is 14, are actually a match for these elements that invade their story in the third act. So they're living in this quiet domestic story, living their little quiet domestic life. And then their world is invaded by warriors and enemies and killing and bows and arrows. But the fourth act shows that they not only have a relationship with those unwelcome elements into their world, they are equal to meeting this invading force with this ability to kill with their eyes. And so let's look at why this is a more effective way to deal with this story. You've got what seems to be a historical story for the first part of it, and then this unwelcome element of war invades the story. And the effect is, because it has not been presaged and foreshadowed, the surprise and the sense of invasion is greater, and we get some empathy with the actual characters who have their lives, their quiet lives invaded. They don't know that they are characters in a story. They have their world invaded by warriors and enemies and killing and bows and arrows. And because the story structure holds that back until the third act, it surprises us in the same way that it surprises the characters. So that is the feature. That is the point of this feature of holding back until the third act. We are able to empathize with the characters more when that element comes as a surprise to us, as much of a surprise to us as it is to them. And also, as I pointed out, it suddenly becomes a different type of story. This becomes a war story, not a quiet domestic story. And then that final act shows that the elements that came before, the two daughters in their quiet life, are equal to meeting this unwelcome element because they can take them on with this power. And then it ends abruptly, in a way that almost feels like a new element, because there's an ambiguity there that is heightened by the abrupt ending of the story that leaves us wondering, okay, what did they mean by they can kill with their eyes? Did they mean that it's some sort of supernatural power? So now we've gone from a historical story to a war story to a supernatural story. That is one possible reading of it. Or is it some sort of sexist cliche that these are beautiful young daughters who are able to seduce soldiers and then slice their throats while they sleep? Or is it a criticism of sexist cliches, a knowing treatment of this trope? We don't know. We will never know because the story just ends. And that's deliberate. What happens then is that this story will stay with you longer than if the writer of the story, the poet Sanyo Rai, had told us what type of story he intended with that fourth act element and told us what happened to the daughters and the soldiers, and answered all of these things definitively. We would forget the story much more quickly. As is, this story will stay with you longer. It will continue on with a longer tale, potentially infinite tale, where in 20 years, this story might occur to you again, and you wonder, what kind of story was that? Was it better because it could be 3 stories rather than 1 story? And in that way, we participate in the story longer. The story has a longer life than if the author didn't trust the reader to participate in the story and continue writing that long tale, those multiple long tales that trail off of the end of the story. This is a feature of the fourth element in Kisho Tenketsu. So I pose to you an exercise, and the exercise is, how would this story look if it behaved like a traditional 3-act Western story that was all based on conflict and tension and resolution, and also required symmetry? I won't answer that for you, but I think that would be an interesting exercise to turn it into the most cliche Hollywood action movie you can think of. That is your homework if you choose to do some homework. I think in doing that, you will see how very different the structures are and what is lost, tonally especially, in the translation to the 3-act structure. All right, now, I know that this seems like an avant-garde and perhaps alien structure, but in fact, you probably have been experiencing examples of Kisho Tenketsu for a long time. And if you grew up with Nintendo games, you've probably been experiencing them for decades, but you didn't know it because they were Trojan horsed into your consciousness. And I'd like to give the example of the film Parasite. Now, if any of you have not seen Parasite, I am going to warn you hard against watching the rest of this lecture until after you have seen Parasite. There is little that you can do of greater importance as a reader or an author or an appreciator or creator of stories than to go and see Parasite if you have not, okay? Please, please, please watch it, and please do not watch this until you have done so. And if you wanted to fast forward, this will take less than 10 minutes to talk about, and I will give a long thumbs up to let you know when it is safe to turn back on the sound, okay? So that's the deal. Please do not spoil Parasite for yourself. You will be depriving yourself of one of the great masterpieces of 21st century storytelling. Okay, so for those of you who have not seen Parasite, you're gone. Everybody else knows that Parasite is this groundbreaking film that swept the Oscars. It was the first foreign language film to win the Best Picture Oscar. And because you've seen Parasite, I won't go into the story in detail, but in summary, here's how Parasite actually breaks down into the 4-act structure. I mean, Parasite is beloved by Western audiences and Asian audiences, and the Western audiences don't know, they cannot accurately tell you why they love Parasite. One of the really fundamental reasons why Parasite is so effective is in fact because of the act structure. So let's break down Parasite into the act structure. Act 1. A poor family, the Kims, struggles to make ends meet. The son and daughter infiltrate a rich family and secure jobs with them through clever con games. Okay? So we've set up the elements. We set up the main characters, the Kims, and this other family, the Parks, who they're kind of in opposition with or parasitically living off of. And we also set up the fundamental question of their financial situation. So all of the elements are there in that first act. Act 2. The Kims escalate the con games to oust innocent employees in the household and replace them with Mr. and Mrs. Kim. So once again, it's the same elements. We've got the Kim family. They're running these con games in the Park household, trying to get money out of working for the Parks by defrauding them. And they escalate that in the second act by now not just taking over jobs that were open, but actually ousting people who had those jobs and replacing them with the rest of their family. So it's a slight escalation, but it really is the same elements as in the first act. And Act 3 is that the Kims, okay, here, if you have not seen Parasite and you are still here, you defied my warning, please go away now. Okay, I'm about to give away a big twist. The Kims discover that there is someone even poorer living below them, socially and literally. The husband of the ousted former housekeeper, Moon Guang. And then Act 4 is that the rich, the poor, and the even poorer families wreak revenge on the people they blame for their plight, and it's not the same people. So let's unpack what is going on here. In the first 2 acts, we think we know what kind of story Parasite is. It's kind of a black comedy, even though it's an art house film, it's very, very accessible. And the Kims are very likable, and their cons on the Parks are very charismatic. And it seems like it's basically harmless. I mean, the Parks, the rich family, are not awful either. They're actually pretty decent people. And the way that we get away with siphoning blood from their family, metaphorically, is that it seems like they can bear to give a little bit away, and it doesn't cost them anything. This is a bloodless, victimless black comedy for the first 2 parts of it. And we are distracted from the fact that the real fireworks and the real theme of the story has been held back because the Kims are so charismatic and their con games are so clever, and we're having so much fun watching them. We're rooting for the underdogs, and we think we know whom to root for, right? Then that third act comes, and then suddenly the story is in free fall because the Kims, whom we were rooting for as the underdogs, are actually holding down people who are even worse off than they are and have ousted people who are even worse off than they are. And when they learn this news, they don't act with great grace or graciousness. They act in very believable ways, but noble and believable aren't always the same thing. And then suddenly the story is in moral freefall because we don't know whom to root for anymore. Our heroes are suddenly villains in turn, and the people that they are oppressing, they're not great either. But everybody's motivations remain relatable and believable. Maybe we can empathize with them, maybe we cannot, but we can certainly understand them. And we don't know whom to root for anymore. And on top of that, we don't know what kind of story this is anymore. The first part of it is sort of tongue-in-cheek black comedy, and then with that third act, I mean, what does it become? A thriller? I don't even know what to call it. But tonally, it really shifts. And the way that scene is shot, where it's revealed that there is a family living in the basement underneath, it's shot like a horror movie with this fluorescent lighting and these green walls, this green tinge, this medicinal flavor to the tone, and these violins shrieking up like in a horror movie as they go down. The tone radically shifts. And then that final act, where everybody wreaks revenge on each other. Mr. Kim doesn't. Again, if you're still here and you've not seen Parasite, what is your problem? But I'm about to spoil some more. So Mr. Kim. Wait, let me back up. Moon Guang's husband, who has been hiding in the basement, kills the Kim's daughter. But instead of seeking revenge on him, Mr. Kim kills the rich Mr. Park in a sort of momentary revelation that it was the rich holding all of the poor down and making them fight against each other for crumbs. But there are certainly people, many of whom I have talked to, many of whom are immigrants to the United States, who have a very different reading, who don't have this, this socialist reading of class unity that a lot of Westerners have in response to that. They say instead, why were the poor people also greedy and selfish? So the ending is quite morally ambiguous. And again, that is a feature, not a bug. It's very complicated morally, and it stays with us. Parasite stays with us in a way that it might not if it had been a tidier ending. So once again, your exercise. Okay, everybody who has not seen Parasite and who obediently went away, you can come back now, and you have a great treat in store for you in the film Parasite. I must give a content warning that there is violence in it, some pretty disturbing violence in it. But then again, it's a Korean film, so what do you expect? So please come back now if you went away. And your assignment, if you choose to do a homework assignment, is to rewrite Parasite if you were doing it in the 3-act structure for a Western studio that wanted to remake Parasite, but curing it of its horrible flaw of not being in English. What kind of violence would you do to the story of Parasite if you were given that task? All right, so that is your additional homework. And now the final case study that I want to share with you is Nintendo's games, particularly their flagship series Mario and Zelda. Now, Nintendo's identity to us is as a modern digital company that makes highly interactive digital toys. And Nintendo is a great innovator in terms of digital entertainment. They have pioneered so many things like digital fitness with Wii Fit, and stereoscopic 3D that didn't require any glasses with the 3DS back in 2011, and early facial recognition, again with the 3DS back in 2011. But what people don't realize is that Nintendo is actually a very old company, and that Nintendo was actually founded, get this, before the end of the Ottoman Empire. And Nintendo has actually some much older code in their games. And one of those codes is, in fact, Kisho Tenketsu. It's on display in the Mario games, and it's on display in the Zelda games before Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild is a very, very different storytelling template. But before Breath of the Wild, the Zelda games also follow this pattern on a macro and micro scale. But let me unpack a little bit from one of the Mario games, an example of how Kisho Tenketsu is built into the gameplay. If you don't know the Mario games, they are a series of games featuring a mustachioed plumber who jumps and leaps and bounces around these virtual playgrounds. And the main appeal of the games is Mario using his arsenal of acrobatic moves to navigate and interact with and manipulate these environments that are like candy-colored parkour playgrounds. And I'd like to unpack one level from the latest major game in the mainline Mario series for the Nintendo Switch called Super Mario Odyssey. And this incorporates zippers. So by this time, Mario has gained this ability to possess any zippers that he finds in the world. So in addition to jumping around and swimming around and running around, he's also able to possess zippers. And that's been established by the time we reach this level that I'm going to use as a case study. So Act 1 of this level is that Mario plays with zippers as doors. You control Mario and you're swimming around in this shallow pool, and you see on the left wall of the pool that there's this zipper. And you swim over to it and you use your ability to possess the zipper and you unzip it along its seam. And a panel opens up when you unzip along the seam, and inside are coins, and you collect the coins and you continue, and you dispossess the zipper and you continue swimming along and exploring the environment. So that's Act 1. The elements are basically the zippers, and the zippers being doors to something hidden behind it. And Act 2 is more of those same elements. Mario plays with more zippers that are doors. So you swim to another end of the pool and there's a temple there, and you find another zipper and you possess the zipper and you unzip it along the seam, and you reveal an opening in the temple's floor when you unzip that. So you go through that opening that you just made by unzipping along the seam, and it leads to another pool. And in that other pool, you find another zipper in the wall, and you open that one up. And so we're just doing more of the same in more in another slightly more elaborate world. We're playing with zippers and finding things when we unzip seams. But then we unzip a zipper and it opens onto an entire other zipper world. And this is Act 3, the twist. This third act in this level has some new elements in it. Mario is using the zippers not as doors, but as bridges. And on top of that, this world is infested with enemies. So first off, we are signaled that we are entering into the third act, the 10, the surprise plot twist act, because the visual style has changed. This element, this stage of this world is different visually. It's more abstract and surreal than the pool and the temple areas, which were more realistic. On top of that, the zippers have transformed in that you unzip them to make sections fall that form bridges. And that allows you to cross these bottomless chasms. So it's not opening little doors in the walls now. These things become architecture that you use to cross the environment. And third and most significantly, the area is now crawling with enemies. You have to either avoid them along these narrow bridges or eliminate them by bouncing on them. And it makes it much more perilous. There was no danger in those first two acts where you were first acclimating to playing with zippers. Now there is great danger because you use the zipper to create a very, very narrow bridge that is infested with enemies. And you got to weave your way around them or bounce on them, but you could bounce off of that narrow bridge that you just created into a chasm and have to restart that level. So it's suddenly an action game now, not just an exploration game. The genre has changed. The final act brings everything together because Mario uses the zipper to destroy the bridge and defeat the enemy. So at the end of this zipper world is this key, and you are questing for this key. And the key lies at the end of this flat plain over this great chasm. And you need to cross that plain, but it's covered with enemies. And you can make a dash and run across that plain to the key and grab the key. You can do that. And as soon as you step on that plane, the enemies start swarming you. But you can make it all the way to the key and grab the key. But the problem is that now your way back is blocked by enemies and they're all coming at you very quickly. And there are too many for most players to be able to defeat or navigate around. So what do? It seems like you're stuck. You are painted into a corner. You are lured into a corner. And that's when you realize that that plane has a zipper down the middle. And then so suddenly you realize you don't have to defeat the enemies. You have a relationship as the controller of the zipper, the possessor of the zipper, with these enemies that were introduced as a new element. And this idea of unzipping things to make things cross a chasm is reversed here. you realize that all your enemies are standing on this plane, and all you have to do is possess that zipper and unzip along the middle, and that plane falls open as two trapdoors, and all your enemies go tumbling down into the chasm. So those new elements that were introduced in Act 3, the enemies, and this idea of these zippers becoming bridges that cross chasms, they are all brought into that final fourth act that harmonizes all the elements and shows that they had a relationship with each other. Your abilities that came before, the innocent playing with the zippers, they are the answer to how to defeat the new elements of these chasms and having to cross bridges over chasms and these enemies that are infesting this area. They came in that third act. The unwelcome elements that turn this into an action game in the third act, they are defeatable by using the elements that came in the first act, which is the ability to possess the zipper. So you're here, you're at the end, you grab the key, you're swarmed with enemies, and you just pop right into the zipper and you sail across the plane, and everything just falls out as these two swinging panels, and your enemies go tumbling down, and you pop out of the zipper with the key and you go on your way. End of level. So that's a great example of Kisho Tenketsu as applied to the Mario games. So I raise that example because I know that there is going to be a fair amount of inertia and resistance to the 4-act structure because people are so inculcated into the 3-act structure. And gatekeepers, if there are any gatekeepers here among you, I don't want to hear that this is too avant-garde a structure, because apparently it's not too avant-garde a structure for millions of 8-year-olds across America that have been playing Nintendo and have played, all of us who have played Nintendo our whole lives, okay? It's not that hard. And these popular entertainments like Nintendo, like Parasite, have proven that we can Trojan horse these new ideas and just make it good. If you make it good, people won't even care that they are being fed something entirely new. And I think that is a great way for us to understand that the world is filled with different aesthetics. So one final word here. I'm close to the end of my time limit. I wanted to address the idea of how we can use this because we're all sensitive to cultural appropriation. My feeling is that learning about how East Asian stories are told fundamentally different is not cultural appropriation, regardless of the lived experience or cultural background of the writer who is studying them. And the reason for that is that I define cultural appropriation as the selective and superficial cherry picking of cosmetic elements of a culture other than your own, while failing to appreciate fundamental differences and values of that culture. So, it's writing a story about China and throwing in Chinese names and Chinese place names, but having it fundamentally be a story about proving yourself and finding your power and showing your parents that you have to be you and finding your self-esteem and all of these very, very Western themes in a 3-act structure that's a hero's journey. That's what I call cultural appropriation, because it's taking the cosmetic elements of Chinese culture, like the names of characters and the names of places, but failing to understand the fundamental aesthetic differences and value differences of that different storytelling tradition. That's what I call cultural appropriation. I think that learning about how East Asian storytelling is fundamentally different on a structural level is the opposite of that. It's learning about how the stories are different on a meaningful level. And we don't have time to dive into why the story structure is different, but I will just leave you with the idea that values influence aesthetics. Western society is a very individualistic society. We very much value the individual, and that's reflected in the hero's journey. It's reflected in the 3-act structure. It is all about the journey of the individual, and there's great value in that. There's reason for those stories, and they do serve on fundamental and maybe even a species level. But I think that it's not unfair to say that many East Asian cultures are more collectivist in their emphasis than individualist. And those values mean that the fundamental unit that we are examining is not often the individual, but the communal unit, whether it's the family or the team of heroes or the village or the nation. It's more about the community. And for that reason, the idea of the relationships among the elements that form our community in our story are going to be the focus. And I think that when you understand that, you understand how the four-act structure arose. This structure that emphasizes the identification of the relationship of the elements, including the elements that were established with a new, perhaps unwelcome element. How do they form a relationship with each other? This very relational focus is a direct product, in my opinion, of the more collectivist values of East Asian cultures. And I'm sure that other people would agree, and East Asian culture is not a monolith. Of course, there are stories about individual heroism and about individual development in East Asian cultures. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying as a general, to understand and appreciate how cultures are different, we can identify different emphases in the cultures. And I think that these understandings of the different emphases lead to an understanding of how these different structures arose. So I think that this is really meaningful investigation into what makes cultures different. And I think that for that reason, it's the opposite of cultural appropriation. I think that everybody is very welcome, in my opinion, to be exploring this. Okay, so I think I'm out of time here, but I will just end by thanking you for participating in this and opening your mind. We talk a lot about diversity these days and about how diversity is beautiful, but I really like the idea of expanding our notions of beauty and understanding that notions of beauty can be diverse as well, and sometimes they can come in four acts. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful Readercon. Bye, everybody.